Hey everybody, it's Luca from Rackets Runners. Now last year, the Pickleball Apes Proline Energy and Proline Energy S were the first Kevlar paddles we tested, so obviously they impressed us big time. Now we finally have a new Pickleball Apes paddle line to test, the Pulses. Now there are three paddles in the Pulse line, the Pulse E for elongated, the Pulse S for standard, I think, the Pulse V, I have no idea what the V stands for, and today I'm only going to be reviewing the S, but I will be talking about the E and the V in the future. Now when you're just looking at these, they don't necessarily stand out amongst the sea of Kevlar paddles. They seem to have a pretty standard Kevlar top sheet. They do have a bright purple edge guard, but other than that, there's not too much that seems to be going on. The real magic of these Pulse paddles lies within the actual construction, and we'll get into all of that in a second. But first, let me remind you that any of the paddles we talk about on this channel, you can check out on our website, racketsandrunners.ca. Also, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, follow me in the store on Instagram, and let me know in the comment section what you want me to cover next. Let's get right into the tech specs because there is a lot to talk about with the Pulse S. First of all, the dimensions are a little bit different to what we're used to. I know it looks a lot like an elongated paddle, but it's actually 16.4 inches long and 7.6 inches wide, which is actually 0.1 inches shorter and 0.1 inches wider than a standard elongated paddle. If the S really does stand for standard here, then that's pretty funny because there is literally nothing standard about this paddle. It's not a standard 16-inch paddle, it's not a standard elongated paddle, it's not even a standard hybrid paddle, even the core isn't standard, it's 16.5 millimeters thick instead of the usual 16 or 14. Finishing up with the specs, the Pulse S weighs between 8 and 8.4 ounces, it has a target swing weight between 112 and 114 and no advertised twist weight. Now let's go over all the technology. This paddle has a very unique design to it. Pickleball Apes hasn't really followed any trends here, which I think is one, pretty brave, and two, pretty awesome, especially considering how it plays. The only normal thing here would be the Kevlar top sheet, which they're not actually calling Kevlar, it's polyaramid fiber, which is just Kevlar. It's kind of like a Kleenex versus tissue situation, where Kevlar is the brand, but polyaramid fiber is the material. After that, pretty much everything about this paddle's construction is new. Underneath the top sheet, there are 3 strips of carbon fiber outlining the perimeter of the paddle. You can see it a little bit more clearly on this image here. It's not a full sheet of carbon, it's just around the perimeter. Pickleball Apes is calling this a carbon ring, and it's there to enhance stability and provide more structural rigidity, which it certainly does, and we'll talk about that more later. It's a pretty cool perimeter system, obviously a little bit different to what we're used to seeing on the edges of a paddle, and underneath that carbon ring, we have a foam-injected sidewall. That sounds pretty standard, and it sort of is, but this foam sidewall is much wider than most. You can see from this graphic here, it basically looks like they took that foam and doubled it. Now I need to make one thing abundantly clear. This is not the same foam technology that you have in the Yola 3Ss, the Gearbox Pro Series, or the Rhombus Ripple. This is sidewall foam. It's engineered to enhance stability, dampen vibrations, and expand the sweet spot, but it's not there to provide any sort of trampoline effect the way foam in those paddles does. We'll get into feel in a second, but you can tell right away that this doesn't feel like those paddles, it doesn't sound like those paddles. So despite the name Pulse, this is not a foam power paddle. Now that's not to say that this foam sidewall doesn't impact performance in a big way. The fact that it is pretty much double the size of a standard one certainly does affect the way this paddle feels, so let's get into that. As you can probably imagine with all this tech going on inside of here, the Pulse has a very interesting feel that I'm going to boil down into 3 parts: plush, crisp, and muted. Now those words don't make much sense together, but that's because this paddle actually provides a very different feel depending on your shot selection, and it kind of all comes down to how hard you're swinging. In a lot of ways, this is similar to other dynamic all-court paddles, but the big difference here is how stark that actual change in feedback is between shots because of all the unique layers to this paddle's construction. At first, when you're hitting slow, methodical control shots, the paddle feels really plush. Obviously more than Gen 2 thermoform paddles, and also more than straight Kevlar paddles like the J2K or the Ruby. I still wouldn't call it soft, not like the Lux Control Airs or the Vanguard Pros we reviewed last week, but you get a nice bit of dwell time that comes from a combination of the thicker core, the Kevlar top sheet, and especially the widened foam walls. Increasing the amount of foam basically magnifies the effect it has on contact, so I'm guessing it's the most important reason for why the Pulse feels more cushioned than the average Kevlar paddle. Now that plushness was the first sensation vibration I felt here, but as soon as I accelerated the paddle face, I got this super crisp response that I was really surprised to feel. I'm obviously used to dynamic paddles, but this was a massive difference from soft to stiff. There was this amazing crackle off the face when I applied a lot of force onto the ball. You can actually hear it. It makes a really loud, piercing sound that kind of sounds like a gunshot. What's happening here is that because you're hitting the ball harder, you're pushing through the Kevlar top sheet into the carbon ring layer, which provides that sturdier response they mentioned in the marketing. It does take a lot of force to get there, but once you do, you can't really mistake in just how crisp it actually is, especially because of that loud sound. So that dynamicism is very much so there, but one aspect of the feel that's consistent throughout any type of shot is that the Pulse is quite a muted paddle. I think there are two reasons for that. One, when you combine two different materials like they're doing with carbon and Kevlar here, the two can kind of overpower each other's raw feels. Two, and this has a much more drastic effect, widening the foam sidewall is doing exactly what it's supposed to do, especially dampening vibrations. Vibrations are what create feedback, and the fact that there's so much foam dampening those vibrations is what gives this paddle a more muted feel, and I know a lot of people are going to like that. Muted may mean less feedback, but it also means that there is a less stark difference in playability in and out of the sweet spot, effectively expanding it, and more foam also means more perimeter stability, which makes the sweet spot bigger as well. Suffice to say, this paddle has a massive forgiving sweet spot. It's not as big as the trampoline effect foam paddles, but one of the biggest compared to more normal paddles. Now let's go over how that all translates into power, spin, and control. I'm starting with power because there's one thing I want to address right away. Despite the name Pulse and the fact that this paddle is coming out when trampoline effect paddles are all the rage, this paddle is nowhere near as powerful as those. That goes for both pop and power. There's no trampoline effect here to add spring onto the ball, so there is a cap on how much you can generate. Now that that's out of the way, the power level here is excellent when compared to any paddle that doesn't have a propulsion style of core. The tech they're using here with the carbon ring is really impressive at adding serious pace to your shot. When you do engage that more crisp feel, the ball really does rocket off the paddle face, so generating depth from the baseline is great, especially when you have time to set up a full stroke. The slight issue here comes with pop at the net. Like I said, you do need to apply quite a lot of force onto the ball to engage that carbon ring, which requires a high swing speed. It's quite soft before you hit that carbon, so while the Kevlar does add a little bit of punch, on volleys when you need to react quickly and you don't necessarily have the luxury of time, the Pulse doesn't have a ton of inherent pop, but that's not to say it's bad up at the net. This is quite a maneuverable paddle because it is a little shorter than 16.5 inches and has a low swing weight, so it's not hard to flick at the ball, and you'd be surprised how much paddle head speed you can generate when flicking your wrist. You won't get as much of that crisp response as you would on a full stroke, but you do get a little more pop on flicky volleys, so it's perfectly adequate for that type of shot, just not up there with the very best. Now when you do have time to generate a full stroke on volleys, this thing has a ton of put away power. I got to hit a few of these during my playtest, and my partner is usually ridiculously good at picking up shots I think should win me the point. Most of the time though, that little extra pace here gave him no chance. So overall, the power profile here is impressive. It's not the type of paddle that's going to bail you out with power out of nowhere, but if you use the right mechanics and generate the necessary paddle head speed, it'll complement that by adding just a little more thanks to its crisp feel. The Pulse is an elite control paddle. The fact that it is so plush when you're not swinging quickly makes it very forgiving in the touch game, especially for dinking. What you want up there in the kitchen when you're hitting control shots is a soft feel and a big sweet spot, so that if you accidentally do make poor contact, the paddle isn't going to punish you. Like I said, the Pulse has a huge sweet spot, so it has all the ingredients. Also, because it does require a bit of paddle head speed to engage that crisp feel, you're not going to accidentally overpower anything, which just adds to that forgiving nature. It's also great in the touch game for drops and resets, but because it has a more muted feel, it's harder to use that dwell time as a form of feedback to guide the ball into the kitchen. I do like having a little more connection to the ball in those random situations because it gives me a higher sensation of control, but this is really nitpicky. It's still fantastic for any type of touch shot. The only part of the control game I didn't love this paddle was in the medium control game. Now, I sort of just invented that term, but it's for any type of control shot that isn't super soft. Because there's such a stark contrast between the paddle's feel when you're moving it quickly versus slowly, when you're hitting a shot that's somewhere between the two, the launch can surprise you a little bit. Obviously, it's pretty rare to find yourself in a situation where you don't either want to hit high power, high spin, or super soft control. but an example of this type of shot would be the return, or at least my return. I hit a chip return because I'm still not totally confident hitting topspin returns, and that's a shot I try to guide deep instead of into the kitchen, so naturally I need to generate more paddle head speed. There were times where I was just a little bit surprised by the launch, but I do want to make it clear, this is still way easier to control on the return than something like a Ripple, a Gen 3 Yola, and even a Gearbox Pro Ultimate. This is one of the best control paddles right now. Compared to the Vanguard Pro I tested last week, it's not quite as soft, but I find it more solid, so it's right up there in terms of all-around control performance. A nice long dwell time with a crisp exit point and a gritty Kevlar top sheet. This paddle is literally a recipe for high spin, and it performs incredibly well for spin in any area of the court. Let's start with spin from the baseline. Even though it is quite crisp when you're swinging big, you still benefit from that dwell time, so you can shape the ball and have it pop out super responsively. I was hitting massive spin here, both on serve and on ground strokes, and I felt like that high spin was a perfect match for the big power I was able to generate, and that's obviously a killer combination. Spin on volleys was super fun as well. The paddle is a little bit softer here, so that dwell time is even more exaggerated, so you can shape the ball really effectively on a roll volley. This actually compensated for the slight lack of pop because spin helps push the ball deeper once it pops off the ground, which makes it harder for your opponent to pick up. This is also, again, where this semi-hybrid, semi-elongated shape is fantastic because it is that little bit more maneuverable, so you can roll the paddle around the ball a little easier than with an arrow curve elongated paddle, and much easier than on a standard shaped elongated paddle. The touch spin game is also elite, although this is once again that kind of hybrid point between soft and fast spin where the stark contrast in feel can surprise you a little bit, but once you're used to it, you'll have no issues for soft spin. There's not much more to say about the spin. It's up there with the very best. To me, it has a little more potential in the spin game than pure Kevlar paddles because it's softer. It's really only the Ripple I can think of off the top of my head that impressed me more for spin. The Pulse S is an elite all-court paddle. Last week, I said the Vanguard Pro was also an elite all-courter, erring a little bit more on control. This one is about as middle of the road as it gets. A lot of those paddles I put into the S tier of our most recent paddle tier list are there because they're also elite all-courters, but most of those are still more on the power-oriented side of things because they are a little stiffer. This has so much control, but then a ton of power to back it up. The only small sacrifice you're making is inherent pop, but that's something you can compensate for by just swinging a little bit harder yourself. Now, compared to foam paddles, there's no spring effect, so the paddle isn't making the touch game harder. Of course, the power isn't the same, but that's okay, and a lot of people seem to prefer less power because it forces them to play better pickleball. I will say, foam paddles have a little bit more of a wow factor. There are times where I feel like I've turned into a wizard doing things that are physically impossible, especially with the rhombus ripple, but this is better if you want to play a more sound style of pickleball. I really recommend this paddle to any player, even beginners and intermediates who are looking to dip their toes into these all-court paddles, especially because this one is so good in the touch game, which is so important to develop early on. I am in the process of switching to a new paddle right now, so it'll go into the discussion, although I do wish it was a little bit less muted, but it's such a good performer I have to consider it. With that said, that is going to be the end of this review. Thank you so much for watching, and remember that if you want to demo the Pulse S or any of these new Pickleball Apes Pulse paddles, you can come visit us in store, or if you want to buy them, you can go online at racketsandrunners.ca.